Thank you for joining us for this edition of People Behind the Dissertations. And obviously we're at the Southern African Student Conference. And today I'm going to be chatting to Tamrin Nicholson about her journey as a researcher, as a young up-and-coming researcher. And more than anything, Tamrin, the idea behind this chat is to actually just get into you as a person, because we know that people write the papers and it's not, you're not just the dissertation, but there's a person behind it, there's a story, there's a journey behind your dissertation. So I think just to start off though, how did you get into psychology? What did you study at undergrad, and what's your story?
Okay. My road to psychology is actually a bit bumpy and maybe a little bit atypical, I'm not sure.
Okay.
In undergrad I studied classical civilizations and psychology.
Okay.
And obviously everyone had the response of like, what kind of job are you ever going to do with those kinds of majors? And after I'd finished my undergrad, I really didn't like psychology, and I really loved classics. And so I went away and worked in Taiwan for a few years to decide what I was going to do with my life.
Interesting.
And in Taiwan I taught English,
Okay.
and that was quite fun. And then I came back and I decided, which is quite terrible, to do psychology at first because it would have better career opportunities. So it was quite a mercenary approach to which sort of subject I would continue with. But in the process of doing honours, I began to love research in particular. I had these wonderful lecturers who were very passionate about research, and that is where I started to become more passionate about psychology and research in particular.
Interesting. What's classical civilization? Could you please enlighten me?
Yeah.
What's I've never heard of it.
Classical civilizations is the study of ancient civilizations, like generally focusing on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's been a long time since I did undergrad, so forgive me if my memory is a bit shaky. But basically what you do is you study sort of the old myths and even things like vases, sports and pottery, but within a social framework. So you're looking at the functions of these particular cultural artifacts. So for example, what role did the Roman pantheon, the gods, play in Roman life? What did it justify? What did it support? I think my experience of it was quite political. I think. Yeah.
Interesting. It's always interesting how people always, get into research by mistake. And I'd ask you to also just to reflect back and at what point did it actually click that, okay, research is actually for me? Because I remember with my personal stories that I was in honours and I decided, and I was doing very well with the assignments, I was writing and I was enjoying the writing process. The lecturer said, if you got above 75 for this assignment, I think you should become a researcher.
Yeah.
And so, that was the moment for me, that was a defining moment for me that I actually want to be a researcher.
Yeah.
What was your defining moment?
I think it was fairly similar. It was in honours, and our honours course was taken by Mary van der Riet, Dr. Mary van der Riet, and she coordinated the research design course in particular, and her interest is in qualitative approaches, and she lectured us on qualitative approaches, qualitative analysis. And prior to doing honours, I'd never really engaged with qualitative research at all. I thought research was very boring and dry. But throughout the process, attending Mary's lectures and Lance's lectures on quantitative designs, it clicked. It satisfied a curiosity, that I've had since I was a kid. And I just thought, if I do this, I can learn about things for the rest of my life, which is amazing. And you can sort of transfer it to almost any topic you want, as long as you frame it within the right lens. So I thought it was just phenomenal.
And you're like, this is where I'm going.
This is the one.
Was this after the Taiwan mission or before?
After the Taiwan mission.
After the Taiwan mission, teaching English. That's an interesting journey.
Yeah.
Do you think that experience of having traveled, having had such a very rich journey towards your dissertation and your master's, PhD, etc., do you think that contributed to your research, and how has it? Do you think is there a correlation?
I think my experience in Taiwan made me very aware of what it was to be an outsider in a society, because the town that I first stayed in was, it's a harbour city, its name was Geelong, and it was there were not many foreigners there, and you were referred to the entire time you were there as a foreigner. So it was very much a division between you and Taiwanese citizens, I guess. And it was my first experience of being truly and completely othered. And it was my first experience of like being immersed in a very different culture, and I found it fascinating and interesting, and I think that is what has influenced a lot of my, a lot of the work that I do. Yeah.
Interesting. And I'm also just interested though, just pre going into varsity as well, because I know people also go into the social sciences by default, as in I didn't qualify for engineering, I didn't qualify for, I don't know, being a doctor or whatever else, whatever prestigious career there is, and they land up in social sciences. Was yours a very explicit choice, or was it implicit? And
it was an explicit choice. I could have gone into lots of other fields, and I decided before I even checked out the point system, before all of that, that I wanted to be doing it. Originally it was English and psychology, and then I changed from English to classics and psychology.
Interesting. And maybe let's fast forward now and go just a bit back to and look at the dissertation process. And if you were to reflect back, how was that journey for you? What were the, because I'm also personally, I'm still doing my dissertation now, and it's a very lonely journey. Firstly, you're always by yourself, and you always need your supervisor, a sounding board, and there are all these emotions that you go through throughout the whole process. How was that for you? What were the difficult moments? What were the highs of the dissertation writing process?
Okay, I found the process like it sort of alternates between incredibly rewarding and you feel like a rush when you start doing something right. And those moments are when you've read enough and you sit down and you write your argument and you know that it's good. And you are like excited to give it to your supervisor. Another one is when I had quite a good relationship with my supervisor, Kevin Durham, and I would go into his office and I'd sort of feel like all flustered and I'd be on the verge of sort of not knowing what to do and being very frustrated. And through conversation, there's sort of discussing your thesis is incredibly helpful. And that was also like a high, because you have like the most incredible breakthroughs when you talk about your research rather than just sit and
be isolated.
And be so frustrated. But it was, for the most part, an extremely, not traumatic, but it was taxing. It was frightening, because there's such an amount of work that you feel that you have to do. And it was overwhelming. And I think the hardest part was sort of before I got my data, because particularly in qualitative research, if you don't have your data, it's very hard to imagine what sort of argument you're going to be making from a discursive standpoint. So I didn't feel comfortable in my project until I'd collected enough data, until I sort of felt confident in the bodies of writing that I was dealing with as well.
Interesting. And how would you say, because I've often heard when we have to select topics and we have to select supervisors, and there's always this idea of you and your supervisor having that very good relationship. How important do you think that relationship is towards the completion of your dissertation?
I think that the way that you interact with your supervisor is very, very important. I was very fortunate to be supervised by someone who was very engaged with my project, who was always free to talk to me about it, who would listen to my ideas and critique them, but not like in a way that was sort of soul-destroying.
Yeah.
You never felt like ripped to pieces. It never felt like you were being stupid. It was not like punitive at all. And that was important for me. I think your relationship with your supervisor, building a good one and being able to speak the same language, being able to work together, is very important because it gives you that support. You're not expected to do it alone. You're expected to be able to ask someone for help.
Were there challenges though in that relationship? Because it's a relationship after all. I mean, we have relationships with our parents, our girlfriends, boyfriends, and we love them to bits, but there are times where there's the tension in terms of I often experience where you think about something and you're like, no, but you know you're right, or you think you're right, and they're telling you the opposite, and you're like, I don't agree. And how did you handle that?
One of the sort of tensions in my research was that it started out being only about gender, and then it shifted towards fantasy. And at the beginning, well, not at the beginning, but somewhere part through, Kevin said, this sounds a lot like fantasy. Maybe that should be your focus. And I was very, very resistant to the idea for at least like 1 or 2 months, and I didn't deal with it very well. I sort of just kept on with the gender thing for a while, and I was a bit stubborn.
And you know that they've got this idea of it. Yes. I'm going to carry on doing
yes.
what I do.
You think like, I know best.
This is my baby.
Yes.
This is my baby.
But when I started dealing with fantasy a little bit, it fit beautifully. And then I sort of felt a bit silly. Yeah.
But I know the title of your dissertation, I know it's got to do with fantasy, desire, sexuality in nightclubs as well. Very interesting topic.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure everybody asks you, when it comes to sex, desire, fantasy, gender, very interesting topic. Weren't you scared? Weren't you nervous of in terms of just a very touchy topic?
I was. I think the way I live my life is can best be described as a kind of feminist. So I don't like saying I am a feminist because there's so many different variations. You don't know which label you're putting on yourself when you say it. I think the biggest challenge there is I'm dealing with a subject matter that is quite sexual and it is quite provocative. But at the same time, I don't want to come across as too moralistic, because then you're judging your participants, you're judging people who take place in the activity that you're observing, and that can be very problematic. You're problematizing women instead of looking at the structures that are implicated in the production of certain practices. Yeah, so I found it quite tricky, and also people's reactions to the project can be very interesting. When people found out that I was doing my master's thesis on the screaming orgasm, which, as you know, is it's a performance and a cocktail that takes place in like lots of bars and clubs around the world, and in some in Maritzburg, and I'm sure there's some in Joburg. And basically it involves a woman climbing onto a bar counter, a bartender across the draft machines, and then binding her hands with the belt.
Was that?
Yes, that was the screaming orgasm. It was exceptionally suggestive, obviously, and at some point there's sort of the mimicry of fellatio, because there's a banana placed at the crotch of the bartender. And even talking about it is problematic, because you don't want to create too much of a, I don't know how to say it exactly.
To stigmatize women? Or...
Yeah, you don't want to stigmatize women, but you don't want to make your topic seem like seductive or...
It is an academic piece, after all.
Yeah, it's, you don't want to sexualize your topic. You don't want to make it seem tantalizing, I guess. So talking about it is very difficult. Well, that's why I chose it as well, because the fantasy produced in text is meant to be when things are difficult to talk about, when you have to navigate some social taboos. We often use implication to get our point across, and it's in those spaces where we're producing a fantasy in the mind of someone else, basically. Well, not in the mind, if it's a discursive argument, yeah.
But I think as well, I mean, I'm still doing my dissertation, and I'm doing my dissertation by coursework, and I'm doing a full dissertation, and you're working with, I often heard you're working with a very tricky paradigm, that is discourse. You worked with a very discourse analysis. How long did it take you to actually understand the language? Because I can tell the way you speak, you've got the language. You speak about production, and you know, I'm doing a correlational study, so I'm speaking about factors and constructs. So it's like, so the language. How long did it take you to get into the language and really understanding the paradigm? Or I don't know, was it because of the honors training were you able to make the transition easier?
Towards the end of honors, what really geared me more towards social psychology and research was I did a course at the end of honors. It was Kevin Durham's social psychology course, and there he talks a lot about discourse and discourse analysis, and he talks a lot about the reification of the mind and how there is no such thing as the mind. which makes a lot more sense when he says it. I'm not going to do the whole argument.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, reification.
Yeah, we're talking about something as if it is there, and we actually have no evidence that it is there. Okay. So throughout that course, we were educated a little bit about discourse analysis, and we were introduced to authors like Foucault and Judith Butler. And through that, I became very interested in discourse analysis. And later on in Masters, in our first semester, our qualitative research design course is also run by Kevin Durham. So we learned a lot about discourse analysis there. So I didn't really have to go too far
conceptually to start from scratch as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because starting from scratch from a discursive framework or discourse analytic framework is incredibly tricky. You have, I'm glad I didn't have to begin at zero. I began with quite a lot of training in it.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned while we're talking off cameras that you are now doing a PhD as well. And what inspired that? Because a lot of people often say that you've done with your masters, go get work experience. You're overqualified.
Yeah.
And what inspired that? I mean, not doing a PhD, especially after having done a master's degree, is not very easy. Because you know the challenges within academia and how much work it is, how lonely the work is, etc.
Excuse me. I did 1 year of work as a research assistant before I did my PhD, but I think what drew me to the PhD is there was an advertised position. It was on you had to be interested in research on social psychology, stereotypes, and HIV stigma. And it was being running jointly with the University of Limerick and UKZN, and also 2 other African universities. And what interested me is that it felt like at that time like my master's dissertation was very, in a sense, it was taken as a very frivolous endeavor by other people. And I wanted to do something where I felt like possibly I could engage in some form of social change as a result of my work. And one of the key goals of the project that I'm working on in collaboration with these other universities at the moment is that we are trying to make changes to policies based on the results of our research. And that is, I think, what drew me to it more than anything else. Because you can address it in many ways. I mean, I can still use a discursive approach if I want to. I can shift to an experimental approach. But the core value there, I think, is that I really want to do something that I feel can affect some change on the world.
Interesting. And what is then, and this is related to this theme that also that you just mentioned with regards to applied psychology, and then you've got the basic, basic research and applied research as well. Do you think all psychologists should move towards doing work that's a lot more applied, that's looking at changing policy, or is it fine to do the experimental stuff and do the theory testing, and where do you think we should go with this?
I think my idea is that a healthy balance is key, because you need development in theory so that you can refine your applied approaches. You need people who are working with theories and making them accessible to other disciplines, to everyone. And you need people who deal with applied psychology as well. My preference is for a split between the two. So theoretical or theoretically dense and also applied. But then I suppose what I'm implying is that applied psychology is not theoretical, and I don't mean that. So I do think that they both have their places. And possibly what experimental and theoretical psychology gives us is a way to act on the world differently, and a different way to see a problem, which is also phenomenally important.
And then, do you think psychology, and maybe we'd also say research psychology, is making a difference in the world? Or, and I know it's a tough question, but just off the top of it, do you think we are really affecting society the way that we can?
I don't know. It's actually been like a sort of personal, private sort of crisis of mine that I've a cyclical sort of crisis that I've been going through with my classmates, with friends, and with associates. We often talk about how we feel so limited in our actions on the so-called real world. I do think that there is room for research psychology to impact on the world, but I think that it's very difficult to make that impact. But I also think that with there's an emergence of sort of like emancipatory research methods, action research methods, participatory research methods, and that is more involved in actual change within communities as opposed to writing about the communities and hoping that they will change. So I think there's room for it.
I mean, I also had a spell at within our coursework. We've got practical placements, and I was working in community-based research, and because I also have this idea that I want psychology to make a difference in the world, and are we? And I'm always interested with regards to that interface between us, psychology, and society. And you often find that stakeholders aren't always receptive to our techniques or the work that we want to do as well. Yeah. And I often wonder then where do we fall and where do we go from here? So yeah, I wonder. I hope we get to make a difference.
I think one of the key things there is that there's this division, like there's the real world and then there's the ivory tower. And one of our biggest challenges, I think, is saying that this ivory tower is the real world. Because when you try to implement change with stakeholders, often I would assume the response is something like, that might work in theory, but it's not going to work here. Or that sounds very nice, but it's not practical. So we do need to, I think there's a barrier there that we need to start breaking down.
Yeah, I mean, the question that came up from the other discussions at the conference as well is that is research psychology an African?
Yeah.
Is the knowledge or the onto-epistemological frameworks that we're using really suited to the context?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the question that they asked. What's your thought? Is psychology an African?
I find that difficult because at UKZN there is a huge move towards an African-centered approach to psychology. And I do think that is hugely important. And I do think that there are a lot of methods that do possibly exclude their own participants, and they exclude the subject matter that they're attempting to study. So that is problematic, but I'm also unsure of what would constitute an African methodology. I think that we need to do a lot of work making one, essentially, I would assume. Yeah.
And then moving forward, you've started with your doctorate, as you mentioned, and then you will most probably finish off your doctorate, and then after that, where are you going? Where do you see your career going? Do you just want to be in academia and publish? What do you see first?
I'm not actually sure. I started out really wanting to be an academic in honours and in masters, but at this point, after quite a lot of studying and after trying to publish and after sort of sending drafts to journal articles and feeling like the amount of pressure that you're under within an academic setting to produce, you need to be producing articles, you need to be producing, yes. And I find it quite pressured, and I'm not sure that is the kind of environment I would like to be in forever. But I also really, really enjoy the work you get to do. Like, I love lecturing. I had the privilege of supervising some students last year, and that was amazing. So there's so many good points about it, but the pressure is a frightening point.
And maybe let's look at that as well. Let's unpack the publish or perish concept. I mean, personally, I've often questioned, like, okay, so I publish in the British Journal of Social Psychology, and they're the ones who have access to this knowledge that's supposed to make a difference in society, but the people who actually probably need that knowledge can't access it.
Yes.
Do you think that culture is healthy? I don't know, I'm of the opinion that it's not really a healthy culture where you just publish for the sake of being in a prestigious journal.
Yes.
What's your take?
I agree. I hadn't realised until I started the process that there's all the journals are very hierarchical. That's a very serious
impact journals.
Yeah, there's high impact, and most of the high impact journals are ones that will cost a lot of money to purchase a subscription or even one article. And the South African journals and African journals occupy a far lower position in that hierarchical, whatever. I can't speak properly at the moment, sorry. A far lower sort of rung on the ladder. And that is problematic because it means that a lot of good South African research is more creditable when it's published outside of South Africa, which is insane. And it also means that it's because of the expense, because these journals are priced in US dollars, how do we afford to be educated? Which in itself is terrifying. I mean, the price of the journals, in particular, I find worrying because it seems like a lot. It doesn't seem like knowledge should be that expensive.
Because ultimately we're saying we want to impact society, but now we're locking up this knowledge. And
and you're making it something that only the privileged can access. So you can only access it if you're in a university, and you can only access it if you've achieved a certain level of education. You can only access it if you have a certain amount of money, and all of those are hugely privileged positions.
And where do you think then we should go with that? Is it the open source culture? Should that be part of it? Should that be like how universities operate?
Yeah. I'm a member of, do you know academia.edu?
No.
Okay. It's a website online, and there have been quite a few articles published on there about online publishing, peer-reviewed articles that should just be free access. And there's sort of a call to maybe change the face of publishing. And I do think that at some point we will need to change the way that we're going about, we need to change the system. But I'm not sure what form the change will take. Like, I believe that access to journals should be free, but I don't know how I would go about making that happen.
Oh, interesting.
Particularly because if you publish in free journals, people automatically think that your work isn't very good. So.
And will you get paid? Will the varsity get paid?
And the varsity gets paid for accredited journals. So.
Well, anyway, I think we've covered just about almost everything. I mean, you can never really fully cover a person's story, but I think we've covered the story behind the dissertation.
Oh, thank you.
Dissertation of Tamlyn Nicholson.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us, and all the best with your PhD.
Thanks very much.
And I'm looking up to you guys, and I'm hoping I get there one day.
You will. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Thanks.
Pleasure.